The entire spacious crematorium hall was decorated with artificial and natural flowers. Many mourning ribbons and hundreds of candles completed the picture. The funeral service was about to take place, and the priest was already standing next to the 4 coffins, looking at his watch. Today, the deceased were only Orthodox, so the ceremony was the same for everyone. A central room was set aside for this purpose. The priest looked at the faces of relatives and friends who had gathered in the hall. Many also couldn't wait for the ceremony to begin. It remained to wait until another funeral procession appeared. The priest crossed himself. I really wanted to swear, everyone had been waiting for the relatives of the last deceased for so long. Finally, the doors opened and a funeral procession entered. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief. The coffin was placed on a pedestal. There was a young woman lying in it. The relatives took their place in the hall, and the priest was able to begin the ceremony. Father Mikhail increasingly found himself glancing in the direction of grieving relatives. The deceased was very young and beautiful. And only 3 people came to see her off on her last journey. They looked strange. As if they were not her relatives, but just strangers. The first was a man in an expensive-looking suit. 2 women were sitting with him, also dressed to the nines. Everyone was dressed in black, but they didn't look like mourners. All 3 of them looked very similar. The priest tried not to be distracted and finally finished the service. Now the family could say their last goodbyes. Once again, the attention of the audience was attracted by the members of the last funeral procession. One of the women started to lean towards the coffin, but suddenly screamed and began to fall. The second one managed to react quickly and did not let her hit the floor. She took out a bottle of ammonia from somewhere and slipped it under her nose. The woman who almost fell weakly raised her hand and pointed at the coffin. In a barely audible voice, she said that the deceased was moving. Everyone started whispering around. Someone was covering the coffin with the body of a deceased relative to prevent the madwoman from approaching him. And Father Mikhail was completing the last words of prayer, looking reproachfully at the man who came with the last procession. That he took the hint and began to pull the women away from the coffin. He turned to the fainting stranger, calling her Albina Sergeevna. He asked me not to throw a tantrum, and not to insult the memory of the deceased. Finally, she got up and moved away from the pedestal, listening to Andrei. Although a minute ago she was ready to swear by anything that she did not imagine. But since the husband of the deceased hostess said so, she had no reason to doubt. And now the last stage of the funeral began. The coffins began to be twisted in turn, sending them on a black ribbon in the direction of the crematorium furnace. The first one disappeared behind the curtains. The relatives hurried to leave in order to forget the nightmare they had to go through as soon as possible. The ashes were given out only the next day. Finally, the last coffin was placed on a long ribbon that accompanied the bodies on their last journey. And there was no one else left in the hall. Only the man who came with 2 women. The owner of the private crematorium was his friend, and he knew how everything worked here. There was another room just outside the door. Coffins were sent there, and it was from there that they were moved to the furnace located in the basement. If Svetlana had been the only one who was supposed to be buried today, Andrei would not have checked to see if everything was over. But there were several dead, and he decided to make sure that the coffin would reach its destination. The man groped for the handle, remembering where it was located, and found himself in a cramped room. The coffin that Sveta was in was the last one standing, waiting in line. Andrei saw 2 workers moving coffins to the basement. He called them, not knowing where to start. They looked at him in disbelief, because the relatives of the deceased usually stayed in another hall. No one came here, only later they came to pick up the ashes. The man said that his late wife's mother had to leave tonight. And he wants to take his daughter's ashes with him. I asked if they could arrange it. The workers said that the burning lasts at least a couple of hours. And the first were the dead, who had been brought in earlier. Andrei asked if they could make sure that the coffin of his wife was first sent to the oven. And, as if by chance, he took 2 large bills out of his pocket that he examined the tattoos on their fingers. They've obviously served prison time more than once. And now one of them, with an impudent grin, asked if he had gotten rid of his annoying wife himself. Andrei said that there was no need to insult him, and pretended to put the money in his pocket. But they were already holding out their hands, not waiting for a second offer. A steel plate with the name and surname was attached to the coffin so as not to confuse the ashes with another one. Then they pulled him off the tape and swapped places with the coffin, which was next in line. But there was at least another half-hour to wait until the previous cremation was completed. Meanwhile, it was already lunch. The workers shrugged their shoulders and decided that they would have time to have a snack. They took out sandwiches and went to the next room, where there were chairs. The owner of the crematorium was against them eating in the room where the farewell takes place. But eating next to the deceased seemed like too much even to these cynical men. And they always left. One of them suddenly looked at his friend. For some reason, he wanted to look at the deceased. The widower was fussing too much. The second one didn't care. He had long suspected that strange things were sometimes done in the crematorium. But I understood that it was not worth getting into it. It's more expensive for yourself. They were given jobs and allowed to sleep in the back room, because the former prisoners had nowhere to live. So what more could you want? Grisha thought. Therefore, he tried to carry out his duties in silence, not interfering with matters that did not concern him. And even when strange cremations took place, without relatives or documents, he just did what he was told. This time, he was also quietly munching on a sandwich and waiting for the next body to burn down. The cremation of the man was coming to an end. There were still 5 minutes left, and then the ashes had to be collected in an urn. They dusted off their hands and went to fill the next pallet. While one was fiddling with the remote control, the other heard a quiet sneeze. And he said to Grisha, "Be healthy." And the next moment he almost turned gray with horror when the man patted him on the shoulder and put his finger to his mouth in a silent gesture. Grisha silently pointed in the direction of the coffin, which they were supposed to burn next. His eyes were glassy with terror. They stared at each other for a couple of seconds, but then rushed to the coffin to unscrew the lid. The sight that opened up to them amazed both of them. The woman who was supposed to be dead was trying to say something. Her mouth was moving, but she couldn't say anything out of horror. The men immediately began to pull her out. Of course, they both had prison sentences and shady dealings behind them. But even for them, who had seen a lot of things, burning a man alive was too much. While the unfortunate woman was recovering over a cup of tea, they sent an empty coffin into the oven. When the woman finally felt better and was able to speak, she told them an interesting story. Her father owned a large business, which she inherited after his death. The day before, she arrived home from work earlier, and found her husband in bed with his mistress. They began to sort things out, and at that moment Andrei hit her. When she fell, her head hit the stone countertop. Later, she came to her senses from the fact that some kind of drug was injected into her vein. Then she lost consciousness again, and woke up only a few minutes ago, when they heard her sneeze. Sveta did not understand where she was. She looked around, thinking she should be in the hospital. But the 2 workers clearly didn't look like doctors. They didn't hide anything and said she was in the crematorium. They expected anything, a new fainting spell or a tantrum, but she surprised them. The woman just frowned and thought. And then she told herself that Andrei would pay. If he decided to get rid of his wife in one fell swoop and get her business, then he was wrong. Svetlana looked at the men and asked if they would help her take revenge. They agreed without hesitation. There was nothing to do now anyway. They were already involved in this case. Besides, it was very curious how such a story could end. The woman was given a mobile phone, and they went to do their job. There were still a few bodies that needed to be cremated. There were still a couple of hours left before the arrival of the unfaithful spouse, and now the appointed time has approached. Andrei, who had no doubt that the job was already done, went into the crematorium. Grisha led him into a hall where there was no light and only candles were burning. I told him to wait a little so that he could bring the ashes. The man was left alone in the dim hall. He felt a little creepy being here. But it was nothing compared to what awaited him in the near future. Now he was free and rich. The jubilation inside grew. He could throw her ashes away right now and do whatever he wanted. Andrei thought that he would hardly ever dare to repeat this. So everything turned out well. While he was looking at the hall, a vague figure walked towards him from a dark corner. It was clearly female, but he couldn't find out who it was. Corporate parties were held here more than once, so he knew everyone who worked here. The woman was wearing a medical mask, and he couldn't see her face. She stopped next to him and handed him the urn. The man looked at her and asked why she was made of ceramics, because he chose brass, and then the stranger threw the urn right on the floor, smashing it, and tore off the mask. The lights came on immediately, and armed men burst in from nowhere. Metal handcuffs were immediately fastened on the hands of the incomprehensible Andrei. As he backed towards the exit, he stared at his wife, whose death he had been completely sure of a couple of minutes ago that he wasn't the only one arrested that day. The investigators still had to figure out what kind of dark deeds were being done in this crematorium. And Sveta stood at the entrance with a straight face and watched her husband being put into a police car. She didn't shed a tear, and she didn't seem to care at all. The ex-criminal standing nearby looked at her with respect. People who are considered close are also capable of committing cruel betrayals. And what would you do if you were the heroine of this story?